After we take our standard count and we record our density standard and moisture standard, we want to input our theoretical max or our rice gravity off of our job mix formula sheet. And all that is our theoretical gravity multiplied by 62.4 will give us our pounds per cubic feet value, and that's what we would input in our gauge. So we would say yes, we want to change it, input our number, use the enter to change the numbers, and arrows will change the value. And once we have that entered, we'll just hit enter, and our gauge will be ready to test. When setting up a test strip at the very beginning of the paving job, you want to make sure that your gauge is set on 1 minute, and the depth should be in backscatter or 0. And we'll hit yes. And now we're set up to record our test strip. For our regular density readings, we want to make sure our time is set for 15 seconds. And the depth should be in backscatter. And we're ready to start recording readings. All right. When setting up your depth, for all the mixtures described in SOP 7.1, your depth is going to be backscatter. So before we start taking our mainline readings, we want to set up a test strip, determine a correction factor for the gauge to give us the true density. So to do that, we're going to set up our test strip according to SOP 7-1, and then we're going to log all our information on the calibrating nuclear density gauge with asphalt core sheet. And basically you'll set up your 10 testing locations, record those in this column, and you'll give this to the contractor, and they'll give you a correction factor back to input into your gauge. So after we get our correction factor, we're going to need to plug that into the gauge. We'll go to the special menu, down to offset, enter, select density offset, and it'll ask you density offset off or on. You want to yes, enable, no to disable, and it'll ask you for that value. You'll just plug that in using your arrow keys and enter. So now that our density offset is input into the gauge, we're ready to start taking our readings. And those will be recorded on our daily asphalt density report form, DT0315. We'll basically have our lots, the station location, the width, the lift number, and the lane number. And here's where we'll input our gauge serial number, the standard count data, our theoretical density that we input into the gauge, and our core correction that we got back, and the required density. Now that we're ready to take our readings, we want to make sure our gauge is set to a 15-second time in backscatter depth. So just to check, we'll put in 15, yes. Depth, backscatter, yes. And we're ready to start taking readings. So to put the gauge in backscatter mode, just squeeze the trigger, push down until you hear the first click. That'll be backscatter. You don't want to just leave the gauge with the trigger pulled up, sit in there. You'll actually have to put it into backscatter depth. And we'll start taking our tests. Stand back about 3 to 5 feet. Okay. And for asphalt, we're going to be looking at the wet density versus for stone and soils, we'll be recording dry density. So we want to scroll down to WD for wet density, and it's also going to give us a percentage of our theoretical. So we would record those numbers. After we record all of our necessary information, we want to turn the gauge 90 degrees. Hit start again, take another reading. And we'll record the same thing, the wet density. And our percent of our theoretical. After we record that, I turn the gauge another 90 degrees. And stand back. Record that information again, our wet density and percent theoretical. Turn the gauge another 90 degrees, one more time. Hit start, stand back. Alright, this process is called the 490s method. We're going to take the average of those 490 degrees readings, and that's going to be the number that we record for our test. And that's going to be for each location. In our first lot, this would be test number 1. That would be our recorded value. So we would come down to our next location, selected randomly, and we're going to do the same thing.